The judge mocked the black veterans' medals as fake. Then a four-star general walked in. The courtroom was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel small. That was by design. The high ceilings, the dark paneled walls, the elevated bench behind which Judge Carl Whitmore sat, like a man who had confused a county courthouse with a throne room. All of it was architecture in service of a single idea: that some people mattered more than others, that the person looking down was, by virtue of looking down, superior to the person looking up. Calvin Moses didn't look up. He sat at the defense table with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and he looked like a man who had been in more uncomfortable places than this and found them less impressive. He was 79 years old, broad through the shoulders, though age had softened the edges of what had once been a formidable frame. His skin was deep brown and deeply lined, the face of a man who had spent decades outdoors in conditions that had nothing to do with leisure. His hair was white and close-cropped. His hands, folded on the table, were large and scarred in ways that told stories he had never told anyone in this room. He wore a plain blue denim jacket, dark trousers, simple boots. Nothing about his appearance announced anything about him, which was a choice he had made deliberately and consistently for most of his adult life. Pinned to the left breast of the jacket, arranged in 3 careful rows, were his medals. He wore them today because his daughter had asked him to. She thought it might help. He had told her gently that it wouldn't, but he had pinned them on anyway, because she was his daughter and he loved her. And some arguments aren't worth winning. He was here because of a parking violation. Not a dramatic one, not a chase, not a confrontation, not even a particularly interesting story. He had parked his truck in a loading zone outside the pharmacy on Millard Street while he went inside to pick up his blood pressure medication. He had been inside for 11 minutes. The ticket had been written in 9. The fine was $40, which Calvin had every intention of paying until the clerk at the municipal office spoke to him in a tone that made the payment feel like a concession he was unwilling to make. So he had requested a hearing. His court-appointed attorney was a young woman named Diane Okafor, 28 years old, 3 years out of law school, assigned to the public defender's office in Harlan County, Georgia. She was competent and prepared and had handled 30 hearings in this courtroom before today. She knew Judge Whitmore's tendencies the way a sailor knows a particular stretch of water, not with affection, but with the specific knowledge required to navigate it without sinking. Judge Carl Whitmore was 61 years old and had held the bench in Harlan County for 14 years. He was a man of moderate intelligence and immoderate self-regard, which is a combination that produces a specific and recognizable type of person. He had never served in the military. He had never been in a situation where the consequences of his decisions fell on anyone other than people with less institutional power than himself. He had mistaken the absence of challenge for the presence of competence, which is an easy mistake to make when the system around you has no mechanism for correction. He looked at Calvin Moses, the way certain men look at old black men in denim jackets in their courtrooms, as a category rather than a person. That was his first mistake. Diane stood as the case was called. She presented the basic facts cleanly and without unnecessary ornamentation. Her client had parked in a loading zone. The duration was brief. The infraction was minor. She requested dismissal or alternatively a reduced fine given her client's age and fixed income. Judge Whitmore listened with the performative patience of a man who has already decided and is waiting for the other person to finish so he can say so. Then his eyes drifted to the medals on Calvin's jacket. He leaned forward. "Mr. Moses," he said. His voice had the particular quality of a man who enjoys the sound of it. "Are those decorations on your jacket?" Calvin looked at him. "Yes, Your Honor." "Military?" "Yes, Your Honor." The judge leaned back. A small smile moved across his face, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes because it isn't coming from anywhere warm. "That's quite a collection," he said, "for a parking hearing." Diane said, "Your Honor, my client's service record has no bearing on the matter before the court." "I'm sure it doesn't." He wasn't looking at her. He was still looking at Calvin. "I'm just making an observation. It's unusual to see that level of decoration on a jacket like that, in a setting like this." He paused. "Where did you serve, Mr. Moses?" "Army, Your Honor." "Army." He said it the way people repeat a word when they're deciding whether to believe it. "And those medals were issued to you by the Army?" "They were. All of them." Calvin looked at him steadily. "All of them." The judge's smile didn't change. "The reason I ask," he said, leaning forward again with his elbows on the bench, "is that we see, from time to time, individuals who acquire military decorations through unofficial channels. Surplus stores, online retailers, estate sales. It's more common than people think, and it's understandable, really. People want to feel significant." He let that land. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Mr. Moses. I'm simply noting that a parking violation hearing is an unusual venue for a military costume." The word costume dropped into the room like something thrown. Diane was on her feet. "Your Honor, that is an inappropriate characterization, and I would ask that it be stricken from the record." "Sit down, Counselor." He hadn't looked at her. His eyes were still on Calvin. "I'm having a conversation with your client." The gallery was small, a handful of people waiting for their own minor matters to be called. They had gone very still, the kind of still that happens when people witness something they recognize as wrong, but feel unequipped to stop. Calvin Moses had not moved. His hands were still folded on the table. His expression had not changed. He had the quality of absolute stillness that some people mistake for passivity, and that is in fact its precise opposite. The stillness of a person who has decided that the space around them will not be disturbed by things that don't deserve to disturb it. Judge Whitmore pointed at the uppermost medal, the one on the blue ribbon. "That one in particular interests me," he said. "Do you know what that medal is supposed to represent?" "I do," Calvin said. "Tell the court." Diane said, "Your Honor, this line of questioning is entirely outside the scope of this proceeding." "I'm broadening the scope. Mr. Moses, tell the court what that medal is supposed to be." Calvin looked at the judge for a moment. Then he said quietly and without effect, "The Medal of Honor." The judge nodded slowly, in the manner of someone whose suspicion has been confirmed. "The Medal of Honor," he repeated, "the highest military decoration in the United States. Awarded for conspicuous gallantry, above and beyond the call of duty." He paused. "There are fewer than 70 living recipients of that medal, Mr. Moses. I want you to understand that I am aware of that number." Another pause. "I am also aware that the individuals who receive that decoration are, without exception, documented extensively. Their names are known. Their actions are recorded. They are not," he said, his voice dropping to something quiet and pointed, "anonymous old men in parking violation hearings." The room was completely silent. "So I'll ask you one more time," the judge said. "Where did you get that medal?" Calvin Moses looked at him for a long moment. What happened in that moment, behind his eyes, no one in the courtroom could see. But Calvin Moses was somewhere else for just a few seconds. Not in the courtroom, not in Harlan County, Georgia. He was in the Mekong Delta in 1968, in a place that did not appear on any map that would have been useful to a person trying to stay alive. He was 22 years old, and the air smelled like fire and rot and the river, and 3 men from his unit were pinned down in a drainage ditch 40 meters ahead of him with an enemy machine gun nest between him and them. He could hear one of them calling out, not screaming, calling. The specific controlled sound of a man trying not to make his situation worse by the act of expressing it. He went anyway, alone, through fire that should have been conclusive. Twice he was hit. Twice he kept moving. He took out the nest and he pulled those 3 men out of that ditch and he got them to the landing zone. He was 22 years old, and he did not think about it as heroism, because heroism is a word people use afterward, and in the moment there is only the person in front of you and what needs to happen next. The medal came later. He had not asked for it. He had not thought much about it until his daughter asked him to wear it today. And now a man in a suit behind an elevated desk was suggesting it was a prop. Calvin came back to the courtroom. "It was given to me," he said. The same quiet voice, the same even delivery. "By the President of the United States, in a ceremony at the White House in 1969. Judge Whitmore's expression didn't change. "Of course it was," he said. Diane Okafor looked at her client. Calvin gave the smallest shake of his head. She sat back down, her jaw tight, her hands flat on the table. The judge began to speak again, working himself up to a formal ruling that would include, from the sound of his preamble, an enhanced fine and a pointed remark about wasting the court's time. He was building towards something. He enjoyed building toward things. He didn't get there. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, not dramatically, not with force. They opened the way doors open when the person coming through them has decided that the space behind the door already belongs to them. A man in uniform entered first, army dress blues, immaculate, his bearing so precise it seemed to make the air around him more organized. He moved to the left of the entrance and stopped. A second soldier entered and took the right. They stood at parade rest, eyes forward, faces neutral. Then a third person entered. She was a woman in her late 40s in a dark civilian suit, with a leather portfolio under her arm and an expression that indicated she had been briefed on the situation and found it adequately described by the word unacceptable. She moved to a position behind the defense table without being invited and set her portfolio down without asking permission. And then the last person came through the doors. He was tall. Not unusually so, but he filled the doorway in a way that had nothing to do with physical dimensions. He wore the Army's dress green uniform, pressed to a standard that suggested the crease had been put there by someone who took it personally. His chest carried a weight of decorations that began at his left shoulder and ended well past the center of his chest. 4 silver stars gleamed on each epaulette. General Raymond Coulter, Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He had flown from the Pentagon. He walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with steps that were unhurried and absolute, and the sound of his shoes on the floor was the only sound in the room. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked at the man sitting at the defense table, and something in his face, which was by nature and by training a controlled and unreadable thing, went briefly unguarded. He stopped beside the defense table. For a moment he looked at Calvin Moses, and Calvin Moses looked back at him, and neither of them spoke. Then General Raymond Coulter came to attention. Every soldier in the room, the 2 by the door, and 2 more who had quietly taken positions in the gallery, snapped to the same position simultaneously, a single motion, as if connected. The general's right hand came up. The salute was the kind that gets performed maybe 3 times in a career. At moments when the gesture has to carry everything a person owes another person and knows they can never fully repay. "Sergeant Major Moses," he said. His voice was quiet and it filled the room completely. "Sir, it is an honor." Calvin Moses looked at him for a moment. Then slowly, with the deliberate care of a man managing an old shoulder injury, he raised his own hand and returned the salute. "At ease, General," he said. His voice was exactly as it had been for the entire proceeding, calm, level, unhurried, as if none of this was surprising, because for a man who had lived his particular life, very little was. Judge Whitmore had been gripping his gavel for 30 seconds without knowing it. He set it down now with a small sound that no one heard. "Who?" he started. The woman in the dark suit opened her portfolio. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice had the quality of a person who has spent years operating in rooms where interruptions are costly. "My name is Constance Whitfield. I am the Deputy General Counsel of the Department of the Army. I am here as a matter of institutional record, and I'll be brief." She didn't wait for his permission to continue. "The individual before this court is Calvin James Moses, Sergeant Major, United States Army, retired. He served for 33 years. He completed 4 combat tours across 2 conflicts. His decorations include the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Bronze Star with V device, 3 awards, and the Purple Heart 4 awards. She turned a page. He is one of 63 living recipients of the Medal of Honor. His citation reads as follows. She read it. The courtroom heard about the Mekong Delta. They heard about the machine gun nest, and the 3 men in the drainage ditch, and the 2 wounds that Calvin Moses sustained on the way there and did not stop for. They heard the specific language that the Army uses when it is trying to describe something that language was not quite built to contain. Conspicuous gallantry, intrepidity, complete disregard for his own safety. By the time she finished, the room was the kind of quiet that has weight. General Coulter had not moved during the reading. He stood beside the defense table, with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes on the judge, and his expression was the expression of a man who is exercising considerable self-discipline. He spoke now. "Your Honor," he said, "I want to be precise about why I'm here, because I think precision serves everyone in this room." He took 1 step toward the bench. "I am not here to interfere with a legal proceeding. I am not here to suggest that the laws of this county do not apply to Sergeant Major Moses. They do. He parked where he should not have parked, and if this court determines that a fine is appropriate, that fine will be paid." He paused. "I'm here because word reached my office that a recipient of the Medal of Honor was sitting in a courtroom while the presiding judge suggested his decorations were fraudulent, and I made a decision that that was not going to continue without someone present who could say clearly, for the record, that it is not." He looked at the medals on Calvin's jacket. "That ribbon," he said, "is the pale blue of the Medal of Honor. I have looked at it every day of my career. It is the standard against which everything else in this institution is measured. The man wearing it earned it at 22 years old, in conditions that I will not attempt to characterize, because I was not there and he was." He looked back at the judge. "You asked him where he got it. He told you. The President of the United States gave it to him at the White House in 1969. That is the answer. That has always been the answer, and the answer was true before I walked into this room." Judge Whitmore's face had gone through several changes in the last several minutes, and had settled on something that was not quite any of the emotions it had passed through, but a residue of all of them combined. He looked older. He looked like a man who had stepped onto what he thought was solid ground and discovered it was something else. He said, General Coulter said, "I'm not finished, Your Honor." The judge closed his mouth. "I want to say one more thing, and then I will step back and allow this court to conduct its business." He turned slightly so that he was addressing the room as much as the bench. "Men like Sergeant Major Moses do not walk into rooms announcing themselves. They do not lead with their history. They do not ask to be recognized. That is not a coincidence or a personality trait. It is something that gets built into a person over decades of understanding that what matters is the work, not the acknowledgement." He paused. "It means that when a man like this sits down in front of you, you will not know who he is unless you ask. And if you don't ask, if you look at him and decide in the first 3 seconds that you already have all the information you need, you will make mistakes." Serious ones. He looked at the judge steadily. The way you treat a person before you know their story tells you everything about your character. The story doesn't change what the right behavior was. It just reveals whether you found it. He stepped back. The courtroom was silent for a long moment. Calvin Moses was looking at the flag in the corner of the room, the same way he had been looking at it since the hearing began. His hands were still folded on the table. His expression had not changed. Diane Okafor was the first to speak. Her voice was level and professional. "Your Honor," she said, "the defense renews its motion for dismissal." Judge Whitmore looked at the gavel in his hand as though he had forgotten how it worked. He set it down. "Case dismissed," he said. His voice was barely above a room tone. "No fine, no costs." A pause. "The record will reflect that the court regrets the tenor of these proceedings." It was not enough. Everyone in the room understood that it was not enough. But Calvin Moses nodded once, slowly, in the manner of a man who has learned the difference between what is enough and what is available, and has made his peace with that distance. He began to gather himself to stand, and Diane moved to help him, and he accepted the help without comment, which was itself a form of grace. General Coulter was waiting at the end of the defense table. He extended his hand. Calvin took it. The general held it for a moment. He said quietly enough that it was only for the two of them. "We should have been here sooner, sir." Calvin looked at him. "You came," he said. "That's what matters." He picked up his cap from the table and put it on, and he walked out of the courtroom with Diane on one side and General Coulter on the other. And the two soldiers at the door came to attention as he passed, and the ones in the gallery stood, and for a moment the room looked like something it had not looked like before, like a place where the right thing had happened, belatedly, imperfectly, but with enough sincerity to count. Outside the courthouse, in the thin morning light, Calvin Moses stood on the steps for a moment and looked out at the street. The town he had grown up in. The town he had left at 19 to go to basic training and return to decades later, to retire. The pharmacy where he had parked his truck, the bench across the street where old men sat in the afternoon and talked about things that had already happened. His daughter was waiting at the bottom of the steps. She had driven him here and been told she couldn't come in. She had waited outside for 2 hours. She looked at him and then at the general standing behind him and then back at her father. "Daddy," she said. "What happened?" Calvin came down the steps carefully, one at a time. "Hearing got dismissed," he said. She stared at him, then at the general, then at the soldiers, then back at her father. "That's it?" she said. Calvin almost smiled. "That's it," he said. "Let's go home. I need to check on the garden." She looked like she had about 40 more questions and understood that she was not going to get answers to most of them today. She took his arm and they walked toward the parking lot. And the general watched them go, and the soldiers watched them go, and the people who had drifted out of the courthouse to see what was happening watched them go. An old man in a denim jacket and his daughter, walking slowly in the morning light. Unremarkable in every way, except the one that mattered. The fallout was swift, and not at Calvin Moses's instigation. The court reporter's transcript was a public record. A local journalist who had been in the gallery for a different case had taken notes. The story moved the way stories move now. First locally, then not locally at all. By the following morning, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By the afternoon, the image that circulated was not a photograph, but a description. An old black man with his hands folded on a courtroom table, medals on his jacket, while a judge suggested they were costume jewelry. The Harlan County Judicial Oversight Board received 47 formal complaints in the first week. The State Bar Association opened a review. The governor's office issued a statement, which is not the same as action, but is sometimes the precursor to it. Judge Carl Whitmore resigned 11 days later. His statement cited a desire to spend more time with his family, which is what statements always say, and which no one reads as meaning what it says. General Coulter spoke at a ceremony 3 weeks after the hearing. It was not a ceremony about Calvin Moses, because Calvin Moses had specifically declined to be the subject of any ceremony. It was a ceremony about something else, and the general used a portion of his remarks to say what he wanted to say. He said that institutions are defined not by their best days, but by their ordinary ones, by how they treat the people who are not powerful enough to demand to be treated well, by what happens in small courtrooms in small counties when no one with stars on their shoulders is watching. He said that the standard has to be the same whether or not anyone is watching, because the people being treated are there regardless. He did not mention Calvin Moses by name. He didn't need to. The people in the room knew who he was talking about, and the people who read the transcript later looked it up. Calvin Moses found out about the remarks the way he found out about most things, from his daughter, who had read about them online and called him on a Tuesday evening while he was watching the news. He listened to her read the relevant portion of the general's remarks. Then he said, "He's a good man." His daughter said, "Daddy, he flew from Washington because of you." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "He flew from Washington because of what's right," he said. "I happen to be the reason it came up. Those aren't the same thing." She was quiet on her end of the line. "The garden's doing well," Calvin said. "The tomatoes are coming in early this year. You should come down on Sunday." She came on Sunday. She brought her daughter, Calvin's granddaughter, who was 7, and had recently become very interested in the medals on her grandfather's jacket and what they meant. Calvin sat with her on the porch after lunch and answered her questions. Not all of them. Some answers require age before they make sense. But the ones he could answer, he answered honestly and carefully, in the way that he did most things. She asked him why he was so calm in the courtroom. She had not been there, but her mother had described it to her in the edited version that 7-year-olds receive. Calvin thought about it for a moment. "Because the truth doesn't get louder when someone argues with it," he said. "It just stays true. All you have to do is wait." She considered this with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to things that feel important. "But what if they don't find out the truth?" she asked. "Sometimes they don't," Calvin said. "Right away." He looked out at the garden. "But more often than not, the truth has a way of showing up eventually. Sometimes it walks in through the back door in a uniform." He almost smiled. "You just have to be patient enough to still be standing there when it arrives." She thought about that. Then she asked if she could have another piece of pie. Calvin said yes. And the afternoon went on the way good afternoons do, quietly and without drama, in a house that had been in the same family for 3 generations, on a street in a town that was both exactly what it was and occasionally capable of becoming something better. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. We tell the stories of the people who carried the weight in silence, who served without asking to be seen, who sat still in the face of injustice because they had learned that stillness is its own form of strength. Their stories deserve to be heard, and the next time you are in a position to decide how to treat someone before you know their story, remember Calvin Moses. Remember what it looked like when a man chose dignity over reaction, and then ask yourself what the right thing is, not after someone finds out. Right now, before anyone is watching.